In 2019, a scientist at the University of Vienna carefully pressed a drill into the petrous bone of a skull unearthed from an ancient cemetery just outside Rome. This isn't just any fragment of the human frame. The petrous bone is the most densely packed skeletal structure we possess, tucked deep within the inner ear. Its diamond-like hardness acts as a biological vault, shielding fragile genetic material for millennia, even in sweltering Mediterranean environments that would typically vaporize all other living remnants. The fine powder extracted from that microscopic sample was prepped, multiplied, and matched against thousands of distinct genomes, both archaic and contemporary. When the results finally arrived, they didn't just add a footnote to history, they spun a narrative that shattered nearly every long-held academic assumption regarding who lived in Rome, when they arrived, and where they actually came from. We aren't simply discussing a dry chronicle of the Etruscans, the Lombards, or the Romans. This is a cinematic epic of successive waves of humanity crashing onto a narrow boot-shaped landmass suspended in the heart of the Mediterranean. Each incoming tide of migrants paved over the biological archive of the last, depositing subtle clues destined to stay hidden until the dawn of genomic sequencing. At least half a dozen massive population shifts over 12,000 years have been squeezed into genetic codes now decipherable from mere specks of bone dust. The mystery isn't just whether modern Italians match their own cultural self-image. The real intrigue lies in whether any historian could have possibly anticipated the explosive secrets hiding within that dust. To truly grasp the weight of these discoveries, we first have to look at the official dogma that stood before a single strand of ancient Italian DNA was decoded. Throughout the 20th century, Italy's past was narrated using linguistic patterns, pottery styles, and classical texts. We knew the Romans spoke Latin, an Indo-European tongue, while the mysterious Etruscans spoke a language so alien it continues to baffle experts today. Southern Italy was the domain of Greek settlers who built legendary hubs like Syracuse and Naples, while the north belonged to Gallic tribes until the collapse of Rome invited Germanic groups across the Alps. None of these facts sparked much debate, but they all rested on one massive, unexamined premise: the idea that today's Italians were the direct biological heirs of the ancient engineers who built the roads and aqueducts. Scholars assume the fundamental genetic makeup of the region locked into place in antiquity, and that everything since Lombard invasions, Norman knights, or Arab emirs was just cultural frosting layered over a static biological base. This foundational belief seemed bulletproof. The distinct regional flavors of Italy, the obvious contrasts between a resident of Milan and someone from Naples, were interpreted as the lingering shadows of tribal divisions rooted deep in the Iron Age. People in the north supposedly traced their lineage to Gauls, while those in the south sprang from Greeks and Italic tribes. Meanwhile, Sardinians were viewed as a separate universe, cut off by their island geography. It was a tidy, logical storyline that synced perfectly with archaeological digs, but no one possessed the scientific tools to verify its accuracy. This technological blind spot permitted a massive presumption to endure unscrutinized for decades, until ancient DNA sequencing became reliable around 2015. Geneticists had to rely on contemporary blood samples to reverse engineer history. The fatal flaw with this method is its failure to distinguish between a community that never moved for 3 millennia and one that was replaced twice, but ended up with a similar biological profile. Without the ancient start point, researchers were essentially guessing the plot of a movie by looking only at the final frame. Early attempts to clear the fog only made the mystery murkier. A prominent 2007 paper analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, of contemporary Tuscans and found a parallel with populations in Anatolia, seemingly validating the Greek historian Herodotus, who claimed the Etruscans sailed from Lydia in present-day Turkey. This revelation surged through mainstream science media. The book on the Etruscans was officially shut. Except it wasn't. Mitochondrial DNA only follows the maternal lineage, passing from mother to daughter. It offers just a single fragile string of heritage while bypassing the overwhelming bulk of genetic data passed by fathers. Reconstructing population history using only mtDNA is like trying to understand a metropolis by knocking on one door per street and questioning only the grandmothers. You might catch a faint echo of the truth, but you are blinding yourself to the vast demographic picture. The technological key that finally shattered this deadlock was the complete genomic sequencing of archaic DNA extracted from those petrous bones. Because this specific segment of the skull is so compacted, it safeguards viable biological information inside skeletons dating back 12,000 years, even in warm environments that usually ravage DNA. Once scientists started deploying this technique methodically down the Italian peninsula, the traditional narrative fell to pieces. A groundbreaking investigation spearheaded by Stanford researchers Margaret Antonio and Jonathan Pritchard completely overhauled our understanding. Published in Science in late 2019, their paper unveiled 127 historic genomes from 29 sites around Rome. The scope was staggering. 12 millennia of uninterrupted human presence captured in code. The data didn't show a stable society slowly integrating neighbors. It revealed a sequence of violent, abrupt biological fractures where every major event fundamentally rewrote the genetic makeup of the inhabitants. The first great fracture struck roughly 8 millennia ago with the arrival of Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Near East. These agriculturalists effectively pushed out the Mesolithic foragers who had inhabited Italy since the end of the last ice age. Those original foragers had a remarkably long tenure. Humans first stepped onto Italy roughly 45,000 years ago, and the peninsula served as a vital sanctuary during the glacial maximum when northern Europe was buried under ice. Yet the shift to farming was anything but gentle. Across Europe, this era was defined by the near-complete erasure of native hunter-gatherer societies. In Italy, the farming wave pushed from the southeastern coast of Puglia up the Adriatic and toward the Tyrrhenian shore. In just a few centuries, the biological footprint of those original foragers was diluted to a mere minority fraction, usually lingering around 15 to 25% of the total sequence. However, that early Neolithic blueprint managed to survive in its most unadulterated form in just one location: Sardinia. This rugged island was far enough from the continent to dodge the routine influxes that constantly remixed the mainland populations. Even today, contemporary Sardinians stand as the nearest living European relatives to those ancient farming pioneers, a literal genetic time vault ringed by blue water. But while Sardinia remained still, the mainland was about to be hit by a second massive fracture. Roughly 5,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, nomadic groups harboring DNA from the Pontic-Caspian steppe flooded into Europe and Italy. By 1600 BCE, these steppe-descended peoples had penetrated the peninsula's center, brought by the Bell Beaker cultural complex. By the time Rome was founded in 753 BCE, the people of central Italy possessed about 30% of this steppe DNA. Within 4 millennia, the resident population had been completely overwritten twice. At this point, the story takes a truly bizarre turn, revealing the myth that modern Italians are just descendants of Romans to be fundamentally deceptive. In 2021, an international coalition led by Cosimo Post decoded 82 genomes from 12 burial zones across Etruria and the south, spanning from 800 BCE to 1000 CE. They were hunting for the Anatolian fingerprints of the Etruscans that Herodotus had promised. Instead, they found absolute silence. There was zero evidence of recent intermingling with Anatolians. Biologically speaking, the Etruscans were carbon copies of the Latins living in nearby Rome. They shared the same ratio of steppe genetics and the same Neolithic base. Here were two societies with unrelated languages, divergent spiritual rites, and contrasting art. Yet they possessed identically matched DNA. Post stated plainly that the Etruscans were biologically indistinguishable from their Latin neighbors. The grand theory of an Anatolian migration wasn't just weakened, it was obliterated at the genomic level. That 2007 paper that seemed to confirm it now serves as a textbook example of the dangers of building an epic from a single thread of proof. If you find the unearthing of these biological strata as fascinating as I do, hitting subscribe lets us know you crave this level of deep investigation. We are currently developing a sequel tracking the unique paths steppe genetics carved through the Balkans compared to Italy. And trust me, the web only gets more tangled from here. Solving the Etruscan riddle wasn't even the most disruptive revelation. That distinction belongs to the Roman imperial period. Starting near the 1st century CE, the biological makeup of those buried in and around Rome suffered a mutation so extreme it ranks among the most monumental demographic shifts in European history. Second only to the Neolithic transition, the ancestral heritage of central Italy tilted massively toward the eastern Mediterranean. Researchers measured an incredible 50% genetic blending with eastern populations. The individuals buried during the height of the empire bore less biological resemblance to their own Iron Age ancestors than they did to people living in modern-day Syria, Lebanon, or Turkey. The engine driving this shift was the empire itself. At its zenith, Rome governed 70 million souls. Enslaved individuals, traders, veterans, and artisans flooded into the capital from the eastern territories, which were far more densely populated than Gaul or Hispania. This human tide wasn't a slow drip. The DNA indicates the influx was fierce enough to re-engineer the city's ancestral blueprint within just a few generations. Rome didn't merely subjugate the East physically relocated to Rome. A 2025 paper from Oxford even found this marker appearing in the late Republican era, 2 centuries before the first emperor. The genetic codes were tracking Rome's expansion with sharper accuracy than any ancient text. 3 proof points lock this reality into place. First, this eastern Mediterranean shift erupts simultaneously across unconnected graveyards and is replicated by separate scientific teams using different hardware and models. Second, the consistency dismisses any possibility of lab contamination or sampling bias. It destroys the illusion that Imperial Rome retained a traditional biological identity. By the empire's height, the metropolis that erected the Colosseum functioned biologically as a Near Eastern city as much as a European one. Third, it suggests that a civilization's identity is never locked in stone. The Romans built structures that survived millennia, but the human beings living within them were in a state of perpetual churn. In just 3 centuries, migration mutated the local demographic so severely that the gap between an Imperial Roman and an Iron Age Roman equaled the distance dividing entirely different modern nations. The narrative doesn't end with the empire's collapse. Following Rome's fall, Germanic tribes like the Lombards swept across the peninsula starting in 568 CE. A 2018 analysis of Lombard grave sites verified this was a true mass migration of families, not just a military occupation. However, the Lombards failed to conquer Sardinia, Sicily, or the coastal south, which remained under Byzantine rule. This created a genetic fault line visible today. Northern and central territories soaked up a Germanic influx that watered down the eastern Mediterranean markers, while the south held onto its eastern and ancient Greek heritage. That Greek influence was massive. Starting in the 8th century BCE, pioneers planted settlements so extensive that Romans called the region Magna Graecia. These were sophisticated cities that intermarried with native groups for centuries. Today, citizens from Sicily and the deep South Harbor measurably higher Greek-linked DNA, a biological echo that has outlived the Romans, the Arabs, and the Normans alike. This reality aligns with a 2019 study that charted 1,616 present-day Italians, revealing that Italy has the most complex genetic structure in Europe. Three distinct groups emerged: the North, which clusters with Spain and France, the South, which aligns with Greece, and Sardinia, which stands entirely apart. On paper, the genetic divide between a native of Milan and a Sicilian is about the same as the gap between North and South Germans, but it maps perfectly onto 12 millennia of localized history. Layer after layer of conquest and migration. While some experts still champion biological continuity, arguing the Eastern wave was confined to Rome or that the Lombards were a tiny elite, the numbers tell a different story. A 50% genetic fusion is a cataclysmic event, not a minor adjustment. A 2024 analysis of the Piscean civilization showed that while Iron Age Italy was culturally fractured, it was biologically cohesive. This only highlights the impact of the imperial disruption, which shattered a genetic uniformity that had withstood centuries of cultural rivalry. Even the Etruscan paradox remains a puzzle. If they had steppe DNA associated with Indo-European languages, why was their language so unique? It's possible the language simply outlived the biological turnover. The genes mutated, but the tongue survived. This drives home a powerful truth. The belief that genetics automatically dictates culture is an intellectual shortcut that often leads to false conclusions. What remains a mystery is how far that imperial era shift reached beyond the big cities. Most of our data comes from a few sites in Tuscany and Lazio. We need more genomes from the deep interior of Sicily or Calabria to know if this was a peninsula-wide wave or localized cosmopolitanism. A 2025 report from Calabria revealed that southern biological paths were already branching away from the north thousands of years before Rome even existed. Italy was never a unified biological bloc, but a patchwork of micro-regions dictated by geography. When you stand in modern Rome today, you are standing atop 12 millennia of stacked history. From Ice Age hunters and Neolithic farmers to steppe riders and imperial migrants from the Levant. Every wave is still mathematically measurable, and the technology required to read them has been viable for less than a decade. The very next petrous bone pulled from the earth could rewrite this entire narrative again. In the history of this field, that isn't just a possibility, it is the guaranteed pattern.